meeting that Sisterhood is sharing with the Israel Affairs Committee here at Bethel. And we are honored to be doing that together. And just wanted to welcome you on behalf of Sisterhood. And we look forward to having you really benefit from tonight's program. I now will turn it over to Joyce Goldklang, who is one of our 3 really wonderful program coordinators and planners. Joyce?
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Sandy. As she said, I'm Joyce Goldklang. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Sisterhood Programming Committee. Co-chairing this event with Sisterhood tonight is Bethel's Israel Affairs Committee. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Kenneth M. Pollack with us this evening. Dr. Pollack is one of the country's leading experts on the Middle East. He is currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Pollack began his career as a Persian Gulf military analyst at the CIA, followed by a stint in the Department of Defense and 2 tours on the National Security Council, including as the director of Persian Gulf Affairs. After leaving government, Dr. Pollack spent 15 years as a senior fellow of the Brookings Institution, where he was also the director of Brookings Center for Middle East Policy. He's the author of 10 books on the Middle East, including 2 bestsellers. His most recent book is Armies of Past, Present, and Future of Arab Military Effectiveness. He received his BA from Yale and his PhD from MIT. I will start off the evening by asking a few general questions. If you have any questions for Dr. Pollack, please put them in the chat function and Bruce Gold will pose them to him towards the end of the evening. So write those questions in the chat. Also listed in the chat will be links to some of Dr. Pollack's books that you might be interested in. Welcome, Dr. Pollack.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're delighted that you're here. We've heard a lot about the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. But what does it mean for Israel? Is it good for us or not? Good for American Jews, good for America, and is it good for Israel?
Ooh, yeah, right to the heart of matters. First, everyone, thank you very much for allowing me to join you this evening. It's a real treat for me. And Joyce, I think that's a terrific question because obviously this has been in the news a lot. And there are a lot of very good, important things about the Abraham Accords, but there are also, it's the Middle East, right? There's no such thing as an unadulterated good. There are also some very important issues with it, and it's worth thinking about both of them. So let's start with the good stuff. First, this is, I think, the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think that we are likely to see more and more Arab states that are going to be normalizing relations with Israel. We are seeing all of this putting tremendous pressure on the Palestinians. And, look, trying to get to the bottom of, who's at fault for the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is kind of a fruitless effort. Both share responsibility, but there's no question that one of the problems that we've had with the peace process in the last decade or two has been that the Palestinian leadership is disunited and disinclined to make any concessions to the Israelis because in part their people they've been fed such a steady diet of prevarications and exaggerations and even outright lies that no Palestinian leader can stand up and say, we're going to have to make some real concessions to the Israelis. And so this is forcing the Palestinians to become more realistic about what real peace is going to look like, right? That's a very good thing. In addition, I think that it is very clear that countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco, all of whom have had clandestine contacts with Israel for many years, they would like a much more normal, open relationship. They would like to pursue all kinds of joint interests. That is going to be great for Israel. It's going to be great for Israel diplomatically, politically, economically, financially, technologically, you name it. all of that is going to be very good. What we have to recognize, though, is that at the end of the day, as important as all those factors are, and they were important elements of the Abraham Accords, what really drove this process is the wider geostrategic shifts that have been going on in the Middle East over the last 20 years, and in particular over the last 12 years. Right? Over the last 12 years, under Obama and Trump, the United States has been disengaging from the Middle East. We are taking less and less of a role there. We are less and less active in what is happening there, very much to the great discomfort of our allies. Quite frankly, our allies, the Israelis, most of the Sunni Arab states are really frightened by our disengagement. The Arab states have counted on us for their security for basically 75 years. The Israelis have always wanted to have us at their back. And what's more, the Israelis will always say, you know, there are some problems that they can't solve. There are some problems out there that are just too big for Israel to handle, and they need American assistance, in some case, a lot of American assistance to deal with those problems. And so both the Sunni Arab states and the Israelis are feeling us pulling back, opening up a security vacuum, and seeing Iran and all kinds of crazy Sunni jihadists occupying the space that's being created as we pull back, right? And really, it's this fear that has been driving this new alignment between Israel and the Sunni Arab states. So while on the one hand, you can see it as being very, very beneficial, and as I said, the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict and a new chapter for Israel in which it's going to have all of these wonderful relationships with its neighboring states, something it's never had during its entire history, it's doing so in the context of a much more threatening Middle East. A Middle East where the United States is pulling back and the Iranians are making gains, right? And this is very, very frightening for the Israelis. You know, a perfect example of this, the most acute example of this for the Israelis has been in Syria, where the Syrian civil war, which has been burning for the last 9 years, you know, if there's any winner in the Syrian civil war, it's been Iran, which has come to Syria's aid, now has far greater influence in Syria than it ever had, is building a massive military infrastructure in Syria. And it's very clear that this massive military infrastructure is there not just to basically help the Assad regime control the country and then allow the Iranians to control the Assad regime. It's also about opening up a new front for Israel. And it's why we have seen weekly Israeli strikes against this Iranian infrastructure that's building up there. And, you know, the truth of the matter is the Israelis, of course, you know, they blow stuff up, you know, every few days, and the Iranians just, you know, clean up the rubble and start rebuilding all over again. And it's always kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, with the Iranians just making gradual progress and gradual progress and gradual progress. And so we have to look at the Abraham Accords and say, well, again, it's great that we're moving forward in this way, but it could be presaging a much larger regional conflict where Israel and the Sunni Arab states are on one side facing Iran and its allies on the other. Right? And over the longer term, that's something that I know Israeli strategists are very, very concerned about. And so as I said, I think that, you know, we have to see that as it's very much a double-edged sword. And certainly better to Israel, for Israel to face that future with the Sunni Arabs as its allies. But nevertheless, it's one that really has to give you pause about the future of the region and the future of Israel's security in the region.
Wow. Thank you for that very thorough and informative answer. Another important topic in the news is the Biden administration's decision to return to the Iranian nuclear deal with certain new conditions. And if you could speak about your analysis of those new conditions, but also how do you expect that to play out? And can you speak about Iran's current political situation and its expanding role in the Middle East, which you just touched upon a little bit?
Okay, sure, but we're going to order in pizza, right? Because we're going to be here for the next 2 days. I'm going to cover all that stuff. Okay, so Where to start? Let me start with the last thing that you laid out, the last piece of your question, Joyce, and talk a little bit about Iran and Iran's politics, because I think that's actually a good starting point for the other two pieces of your question. So the first thing that we need to recognize is that, in 2009, Iran had this would-be revolution, what we call the Green Movement, the Green Revolution, where millions of Iranians took to the streets to try to overthrow the government. And of course, they were crushed by Iran's security services. Nevertheless, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who runs Iran, the real leader of Iran, he recognized that this was something very dangerous, that the numbers of people who were taking to the streets demonstrated that his people were very unhappy about their state of affairs, right? And he didn't like the fact that all these people were taking to the streets and calling for his overthrow. Right? So in 2013, he allows a moderate to win the presidency of Iran. Now, the presidency of Iran is not like the president of the United States. He doesn't call the shots. Again, Khamenei does, but he's not unimportant either. And what was important about allowing Hassan Rouhani to become president was that Rouhani is someone who has always believed that having a reasonable relationship with the United States and the outside world was important for Iran because it would be good for Iran's economy. And Rouhani basically said, look, we're going to make a deal with the Americans. It will open up our economy. The people are most unhappy about our economy. That'll make the people happy. And then they won't revolt against us again. So Khamenei went along with that. Now, they've made it very clear that ultimately Khamenei was not very happy with the deal that Rouhani signed with President Obama, the Iran nuclear deal, right? We know about the stuff we don't like about the Iran nuclear deal. What we don't know about most of the time is that the Iranians hated it, or at least the Iranian hardliners hated it as much as our hardliners hated it, right? Our hardliners felt it was too kind to the Iranians, gave them too much, didn't hold them accountable. The Iranian hardliners felt the same thing from their end. And in particular, what they consistently said was, this is too good for the Americans. We're making too many concessions. We're not getting enough from them. You can't trust the Americans. They'll cheat, they'll lie, and they'll ultimately walk away from the deal, right? And when they walk away from the deal, they're going to leave us holding the bag, because we're not just signing this agreement with the Americans, we're signing it with the other 5 countries and with the United Nations. It's going to be enshrined in a Security Council resolution, and it's going to be really bad for us. Went ahead and signed the deal. And of course, then Donald Trump comes to office and does exactly what the hardliners predicted the United States would do. We walk away from the deal, leaving the Iranians holding the bag. That completely undercut President Rouhani and all of Iran's moderates, right? And what we've seen from Khamenei, the supreme leader, is just anger and vitriol toward the president, publicly excoriating him for signing the nuclear deal, saying, I told you, you can't trust the Americans. So as a result of that, Rouhani was completely undercut politically. And what we've seen in the years since has been the ascendance of Iran's hardliners. These are the guys who are now in charge of Iran. And for those of you who've been paying attention to the news, right, we've seen the Iranian hardliners' foreign policy in action, right? These are the guys who wanted to attack Saudi Arabia and attack the UAE and attack our forces in Iraq. That's the hardline foreign policy. Confront the Americans, use violence, give the Americans nothing. So the hardliners are very much in the ascendance. This now is where we are with the Biden administration. They're coming back into power. This is, many of them the group who were in with President Obama. We're now 4 years down the road. There's much less time in the more stringent provisions of the Iran nuclear deal, right? The most stringent provisions were only meant to last 10 years. They expire in 2025. It's 2021 already. But the Iranians have made a lot of progress on their nuclear program, right? And it's dangerous to allow the Iranians to keep enriching uranium. And we've heard the president, that's President Biden, and many of his senior advisors saying, we got to get the Iranians into the nuclear agreement, get them back into it, shut down their program again. But what they're also saying, makes a lot of sense to us, is again, the nuclear agreement was never a perfect deal, right? From our perspective, it had some major problems. In particular, there were these sunset clauses. As I said, the most stringent provisions run out in 2025 and 2030. We'd like to extend them. Ballistic missiles weren't included. There are a lot of people who would like to include them. Just as a sidebar, I don't think the ballistic missiles are something we ought to worry about, because the truth is, and I've been saying this for years, but we're now seeing it play out, right? The drones are so much more dangerous than the ballistic missiles. The ballistic missiles, that's your grandfather's technology. The drones are the way of the future, right? And there's no way to deal with them in this kind of an agreement. So I wouldn't get too wrapped around the axle about the ballistic missiles, but we probably will anyway. And then there's also provisions about inspections that we want tightened, right? So we want all these changes made. The Iranians are making it very clear. Again, the hardliners are making it very clear they want none of that. What they're saying is, we hated the JCPOA. You want to come back to the JCPOA? Fine. Khamenei has said, glad to come back to the JCPOA as it was agreed to, nothing else. Right? Biden administration, starting with the president, keeps saying, we've got to make the deal better. It's got to be expanded, it's got to be lengthened, etc. This is the real problem that I think that they're going to run into in the next few months. And I think that we probably already got our answer. Because the Biden administration wants to get this thing wrapped up because they want to stop Iran's nuclear progress, and also because Iran is going to have new presidential elections in June, and dollars to donuts, we're going to get a hardline president, right? So Rouhani's going to be gone. The last voice of moderation is going to be out of there. It will be a uniformly hardline government. There's not going to be anybody who wants to make additional concessions to the Americans. Plus, let's try to remember current events. We're dealing with a worldwide pandemic and the worst economic crisis that the United States has faced in 100 years. President Biden has got to deal with all of that stuff. He also has, even after that, then there's little stuff like healthcare, infrastructure, immigration, right? Iran is about 97th on his list of priorities, right? And so my expectation of what's going to happen is they will sit down with the Iranians. They'll say, hey, we want to improve the deal. The Iranians are going to say, no way. If you want to if you want to reopen negotiations, forget about it. We're going home. But if you want to go back to the original deal, fine, we'll go back to the original deal. My guess is 6 months from now, maybe even less than that, maybe even in a month or two, you will have the administration announce that we're going to go back to the original deal. Might be phased, it might be we're going to do this and then take that step, and the Iranians will take this step, right? It'll be phased, but we'll get back to the original deal probably fairly quickly. And then we will have continued negotiations with the Iranians over expanding and lengthening the deal thereafter. And that to me is the most important issue. And it's the most important issue because of the first question you asked me, Joyce, which is about our allies. Because truth be told, my conversations with our allies, the Israelis, the Sunni Arabs, they're expecting this, right? They're expecting all this. What they want to know is Biden going to actually make good on that promise? Will he continue to push the Iranians? Will he continue to press for a follow-on deal? Or is he going to say, you know what, I'd love to have a follow-on deal if I could, but truth be told, it was hard enough to just get back to the JCPOA, and now I got to deal with COVID-19 and the economy and everything else, and Iran, that's going to be on the back burner. Because that's going to be the politically expedient course of action for Joe Biden. But if he does that, that's going to be the worst answer possible for our allies, right? And that's when, I don't know exactly what they're going to do, but that's going to make them really frightened and really uncomfortable.
Really? Well, that leads me to my next question. How do you see the Biden administration approaching the Middle East? Will it be Barack Obama's policy, Bill Clinton's, something else? And what does it mean for the other countries of the Middle East?
Yeah, good segue. So I think I would answer it this way. I think that if we could actually, if you had Joe Biden here instead of me, and Joe, we're willing to be as honest with you as I'm being with you, right? He is president. He's got to cover his behind. I think what he would probably tell you is he'd like to be something in between Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, right? He doesn't want to invest in the Middle East as much as Bill Clinton, right? I mean, Bill Clinton, first, he made a lot of effort with, I was Bill Clinton's Persian Gulf director at the NSC, right? We made the opening to Iran. I'm very proud that we did. It didn't work, but he and President Clinton invested a lot in that, right? He was the one who laid out the policy of regime change against Iraq, put a lot into that. And of course, for President Clinton, the Arab-Israeli peace process was a huge priority, and he put an enormous amount of blood, sweat, and tears into that. I think that President Biden will look at that and say, you know what, I don't want to put that much effort into the Middle East. It's not as important. It is comparatively less important compared to COVID-19 and the economy, but even on foreign policy, it's not as important as Russia and China and dealing with all of those other problems. But I also do suspect, and he may never say this, but I suspect that he would also say, Obama went too far. Obama thought the Middle East was unimportant, thought he could just walk away from it. And, I have two little expressions I use about the Middle East whenever somebody says something like that to me, which is, one, the Middle East is not Las Vegas. What happens there doesn't stay there, right? And two, the Middle East is like a shark, right? If it stops moving, it dies. And if you don't pay attention to it, it will come up and bite you in the behind really hard, right? And that was what Barack Obama learned, much to his chagrin. And I think that Joe Biden learned that lesson. So I think that's what he'd like to do. I think he'd like to pay less attention to it than Bill Clinton, more than Barack Obama. And in particular, and I think we're already starting to see this, to a certain extent with Biden, a lot of it seems to be that the meetings will be the message, right? He's going to change the tone on the Middle East. He is going to try to show more love to our allies, not walk away from them the way that, honestly, both President Obama and President Trump did, right? And in some ways, Trump was worse than Obama. He's going to try to make them feel like the United States has their back. Just don't ask us to come unless it's really critical, right? And I think that's how he'd like to handle it. As you heard me say in answer to your first two questions, I'm not sure that that's gonna cut it. I'm not sure he's gonna really be able to square that circle. I suspect that there are going to be problems in the Middle East. And as I said, I think the biggest one and the first one is likely to be Iran, where I don't think he's going to be able to get anything more than going back to the original JCPOA. And I think we're going to be fine with it. And I think our allies are going to be terrified by it. And that is going to create a very significant gap, which is going to cause them to start acting unilaterally to protect themselves. And, the Israelis do things that we don't always like, but they have capability. The problem is when our Sunni Arab allies try to protect themselves, they do things like invade Yemen, right? Which turn out really, really badly.
Well, I just want to remind people and tell people that may have come in a little late that Dr. Pollack will be taking questions that you can pose in the chat function. And after maybe one more question, we'll go to the audience questions. What are the implications of the Biden administration's withdrawal of support for Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen against the Iran-backed Houthi rebels?
Yeah, great. Another great question, Joyce. And again, another perfect segue from your last one, because the answer there is we don't know, right? I'm guessing none of you, or very few of you, probably watched or read his speech at the State Department the other day. I did, right? Because that's my job. That's why you talk to me, right? Is because you need somebody who that's their job to do it. And he was very careful in his choice of words, right? And he made this very clear distinction between not supporting offensive Saudi actions, but absolutely continuing to support the defense and security of Saudi Arabia. Well, the problem there is, as an old military analyst, I can tell you it's almost impossible to distinguish clearly between what's offensive and what's defensive, right? For those of you who can remember it, and those of you who may have studied it in school, remember the Yom Kippur War. The Egyptians and the Syrians launch their massive attack on Israel using weapons that everyone considers very defensive, right? Their main weapons were anti-tank missiles and anti-air missiles, right? Those are the kinds of weapons that most people look at and say, yeah, those things are purely defensive. Well, that's how they launched their attacks on Israel. Right? And this is a fundamental problem. And again, what I heard when Joe Biden said that was, again, an effort to square the circle. Right? First, he's got the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They hate Saudi Arabia, right? They've, I don't know when this happened, but they've decided that Iran is great and Saudi Arabia is awful. The correct answer, of course, is that neither of them is great. But this is where they are. But again, Joe Biden is more of kind of a traditional Democrat on foreign policy, right? Who understands the values of our alliances, who recognizes that there is still a tremendous amount that the United States gets from the alliance with Saudi Arabia. I do think, because Joe said this any number of times. In fact, he said, I've given talks where he and I are the two on the dais, right? And he said this on the stage, standing next to me, that he doesn't like the human rights abuses out there. He believes that we need to be harsher with our allies on it. So I don't think he's just saying that. I think he'd really like to see it happen. I think what he's hoping is that with symbolic actions, and by basically saying to the Saudis, you're not going to get a free pass anymore, that they're going to figure out that it'll be their, pardon the pun, right, because it's Saudi Arabia, but it'll be their come to Jesus moment, right? And they'll figure this all out, and and they'll get religion. Sorry, with all the puns. I think that's really what he'd like to have happen. And look, I think that there is some, I don't think that that's totally unrealistic. In my own conversations with senior Saudi princes, they get the fact that they really screwed up with the Khashoggi killing, right? They understand that they have a real problem with the imprisonment of Loujain al-Ahlul, the other female protesters, right? They recognize that this is not playing well in the rest of the world, and if they want to have international support, they've got to figure out a way out of this. The question really is, how far are they ready to go? And is it going to be enough for the Biden administration? And is there room for compromise, right? Because if the Saudis take some steps to show good faith, and what the Biden administration does is mostly symbolic, and then there's just a gap that needs to be bridged, and both sides can come, I think they can work it out. The issue is, at some point, is there something where either the Saudis haven't figured this out, as much as I'm hearing from them, right? And they don't want to do this for whatever reason. And Biden comes in and says, by God, you've got to let Loujain go, or you've got to hold this person accountable. And Mohammed bin Salman, Prince of Saudi Arabia, says, absolutely not over my dead body, right? That's where things could become very, very problematic, right? But then beyond that, I want to go back to this point that I keep making, which is that strategically, we could be facing a real impasse, a real fork in the road with ourselves and our Arab allies. And again, my sense is that the Biden administration is hoping that by reassuring them, by saying to them, we're not going to keep walking away from you, but you need to understand that we're not just going to defer to you on everything, that's going to be enough, that will keep the Saudis and the other Arab states on the reservation and not cause them to kind of go off and do more aggressive, unhelpful things like invading Yemen. It's not clear that that actually will be the case. And that's why I believe, again, why whatever we decide to do after the Iran nuclear deal is renegotiated, which, as I said, I actually think is the easier part of the problem. It's what we do afterwards that's going to matter most, because that's what really matters to Saudi Arabia. And just to finish on this note, we see Saudi Arabia from our perspective, right? And we see it as this kind of, 8th century, primitive society that's totally out of step with reality, has more money than is good for it, right? It's not necessarily wrong. That's not how they see themselves, right? And it's also not how they see us, right? And in particular, what they've seen from us is the United States that has walked away from an agreement that we've had with them for 75 years, right? Where they have honored every single aspect of that agreement, right? They have sold us discounted oil. They have bought enormous amounts of military equipment and other stuff that frankly they didn't need and never intended to use. It was a giant payoff to us. They paid for all kinds of stuff. And again, I can remember when I was at the White House, most people probably don't even remember this, right? The Clinton administration negotiated this cockamamie deal with the North Koreans to try to turn off their nuclear program. We were going to build light water reactors for them so that they didn't need the heavy water reactors, which is what you use to build nuclear weapons, right? Who funded those light water reactors? The Saudis and the Kuwaitis, right? And they didn't do it because they give a tinker's damn about Korea, right? They did it because we asked them to. Right? It was nothing but, another payoff to us. So from the Saudi perspective, they have honored every single last iota of their relationship to us. And now under Obama and even worse under Trump, we're walking away from it. The Iranians attack them. And by the way, the Iranians are attacking them on a weekly basis. It doesn't even make the newspapers, but on a weekly basis, there are Iranian drones and ballistic missiles being fired at the kingdom, right? And we're doing nothing about it, right? And that is frustrating, would be a massive understatement for them. That's why for them, it's going to be critical to see what the Biden administration, does after the nuclear deal.
Wow. So, Bruce, would you like to jump in with any audience questions that you have? Thank you for that.
Yes. Thank you, Joyce. Yeah, we have a number of questions. They're kind of split between issues related to the region in general and then specific to Israel. So picking up on what Dr. Pollack was just talking about, let me read one of the questions tied more to the region. And the questioner asked, as the US disengages in the Middle East, and you talked about what that means in terms of definition of that word, but as this occurs and Russia and Turkey fill that vacuum, what's your view of Russia's relationship with Israel, and how could Israel be helped or hurt by growing Russian influence in the region?
Yeah, that's a great question, because Russia's relationship with Israel is a fascinating one. The Israelis have, worked incredibly diligently to try to maintain a good relationship with the Russians, right? They've done, superbly at keeping Putin sweet on Israel, which has been very helpful to the Israelis. As I mentioned before, the Israelis are conducting weekly airstrikes against Iranian positions and sometimes Syrian positions and Hezbollah positions in Syria. Well, let's remember who owns half of Syria's airspace. It's Russia, right? The Russian Air Force and the Russian Air Defense Forces are what control half of Syria's airspace. We own the other half, right? And the Russians have done nothing, right? They allow the Israelis to do whatever they want to against the Iranians. And this is, the fruits of the Israeli government's very deliberate efforts to keep Russia sweet. In addition, Russia has a very kind of complicated approach to the Middle East. First, Russia doesn't have any particular interests in the Middle East, right? This is Russia. It's not the Soviet Union. Russia's not looking to take over the world. It has much more specific interests. It's got some allies there, and it wants to be able to say, we supported our allies, we're good at supporting our allies, so other people should ally with us. Right? They have a very strong relationship with the Iranians, which of course is problematic for the Israelis. In addition, the Russians, of course, would like to see the price of oil high, right? Most of our allies would like to see the price of oil, not necessarily high, but stable, right? And look, if they could have it high, they'd probably like it higher than it is. But the Saudis, our Gulf allies, they're smart enough. They've known for years, for decades, you don't want the price of oil to be too high, because if the price of oil is too high, people start buying electric cars, right? And investing in solar power, right? So the Gulf states learned decades ago, you want to keep the price of oil at a level where the American consumer can purchase it easily, right, and not cripple the American economy. Russians don't care about that. They'd be glad to cripple the American economy. They want the price of oil as high as they possibly can. Right? So Russia's interests are much more complex. And, I think the question is just a great one, because as the United States pulls back, first, I just think that the region could become more chaotic and more conflictual. And in those circumstances, first, Russia's going to have more opportunities, and we don't know what the Russians are going to do, but I also think they're going to face more dilemmas, because some of their allies may get themselves into trouble. In particular, as I said, they've got a pretty good relationship with the Iranians. Well, the Iranians could get themselves into trouble by trying to fill the vacuum that we're creating more than they're able to, right? The Iranians have certain capabilities, but they're not 10 feet tall. And if the Iranians overextend themselves, they could get into trouble and then call on their friends, the Russians, and then Putin's going to have a choice, right? Do I really want to get involved in some cockamamie conflict in, I don't know, Jordan or somewhere? Is that really important to me? And let's remember, as powerful as Putin is, we've seen with the protests in Russia, he isn't all powerful. He does have domestic politics to worry about. And what we've seen from him very consistently is the Russian people, they're probably even less interested in being involved in the Middle East than the American people are, right? Because the Russians have even less at stake in the Middle East than we do. So I think that Russia's interests are up for grabs at the moment. And I think that the Israelis have been very smart about trying to maintain this close relationship with the Russians. But I think that as we go down this path, Russia is going to be one of the countries whose future in the Middle East is going to be uncertain. And they could move one way, they could move the other, depending on the circumstances. But it's going to be one where I don't think that we know what Russia does, but whatever they do will be a big part of knowing how bad the Middle East gets.
Well, that's a mouthful. It's a lot. I thought we could bounce around and reflect the nature of the question. So let's move it to Israel again. I think earlier in the evening, you started talking a little bit about concessions on both sides for the Israeli and Palestinian conflict and its resolution that may be, as you said, beginning at the beginning. We're at the beginning of a movement here. So the question that came up is, what kind of Palestinian concessions are you thinking about? And probably you could comment on what Israeli concessions would be appropriate in that same context.
Sure. So, I'm going to put my cards on the table. There's no reason for me not to. I believe in the two-state solution, right? I continue to believe in the two-state solution very simply because I can't imagine any other solution that will work for the state of Israel that allows Israel to maintain both its Jewish and its democratic character, right? And until somebody can come along and show me a one-state solution plan or a three-state solution plan that does that, I'm going to stick with the two-state solution. As far as what the two-state solution looks like, I think we know exactly what the two-state solution looks like. I think that it is something that the United States in particular has continuously laid out in greater and greater detail over time, beginning with the Clinton parameters from when I was at the White House, but ultimately culminating, I would argue, in the deal that Ehud Olmert put on the table in 2007 at Annapolis. Okay, to me, that was peace. And I think that any person of good faith who were to look at that agreement would say, yeah, this is peace, right? We got to the point where, 97% of the land had been agreed to, right? There was, a clear statement about, clear compromises on Palestinian demilitarization and Jerusalem and right of return and, ownership of the holy sites, right? Every single thing that had been negotiated for the past, take your pick. You want to say 10 years, you want to say 20 years, you want to say 50 years, I'll go with any of those numbers, right? But what Ehud Olmert put on the table in 2007 to me was peace, right? And the problem was that we did not have a Palestinian leadership that was able to say yes to it. Now, that was because of two different sets of factors. One, the point that I made before, which is that the Palestinian people have been fed a steady diet of lies by their leaders for decades, right? No one has ever actually been honest with them and said, listen, there's not going to be a right of return, right? We're going to get symbolic compensation. That's it, right? And, Jerusalem, well, it may well be Abu Dis, not necessarily the old city, right? These are things that the Palestinian leadership understands, but they've not been willing to go to their people because they're all afraid that if they go to their people and say it, they're going to wind up like Anwar Sadat, right? And be killed for actually being the person who does the thing that everybody else in the world knows has to be done. In addition, and this brings us back to Joyce's original question about the Abraham Accords, right? The other issue out there was always that the other Arab states had their own interests in the peace process, right? So, again, I can remember when I was at the White House, right? Back when I was at the White House, I did the Persian Gulf. Rob Malley, now our envoy to Iran, he did the peace process. And so when they all went off to Camp David in 2000, I was the guy left behind. And so when at Camp David, President Clinton wanted to speak to Mubarak and King Fahd and King Abdullah of Jordan, and I think King Mohammed of Morocco, I was the guy who had to set up the calls. I was the guy on the call as the note taker. Right? And what was fascinating about all of that was, President Clinton tried to lay things out, get their support. He said, look, Ehud Barak was then the prime minister of Israel. Barak has made these remarkable concessions. We got to get Arafat to put something on the table. Arafat is resistant. Could you guys help me out? And make a long story short, every one of them said, in effect, no, because I have my own interests, right? And I'm not going to let Yasser Arafat give away my interests, right? And so both of those factors killed 2007, made it impossible to have Ehud Olmert's deal, which is it was peace, accepted by the Palestinians. What's changed, right? What's made me hopeful that maybe we will get peace is the fact that that second element is now gone, right? The Arab states are increasingly saying, you know what? Our only interest in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that we have peace. That's all we care about. Just get peace and get it off my plate. I don't want to have to worry about it. That's a critically important change. What hasn't changed yet, but as I said, we're starting to see maybe some movement. And again, I'm trying to be optimistic. I'm trying to be hopeful here, is that the Palestinians, I think, are starting to realize that if they lose all of that Arab support, then they are going to become second-class citizens. And that the smart thing for them to do is to cut a reasonable deal with Israel while they still have some degree of Arab backing. So, Bruce, to your earlier points, if you want short answers from me, you need to ask me dumber questions than you're asking me. And if you want uplifting questions, then we need to talk about something other than the Middle East. But there, I at least tried to be uplifting on one point about the Middle East.
I'm saving my dumb questions for myself later. I'll get back to you. But I have very intelligent questions from people who have joined us this evening. So let me move back to the the broader Middle East. Someone asked a great question here about the Iranians, and it goes back to the nuclear deal, effectively. So the question is, don't the Iranians need to make concessions in order to have sanctions lifted? That's such a big part of what has happened in the last few years. Isn't that hurting their economy and still producing public anger among the Iranian population? Considering what you talked about in terms of clamping down on protest, that's still, I think, a very good question that I thought would be important to put on the table early in our conversation tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. But for the Iranian people, what they want is they want our sanctions lifted again. And actually, technically, they're not lifted. It's worth noting that. We never lifted any sanctions on Iran. All we did was issue waivers. And this was part of what the Iranian hardliners were saying was, you're basically selling our patrimony for a handful of magic beans, right? You're not even getting the Americans to lift their sanctions. All you're doing is getting a president who's going to issue waivers, and you can get another president who could just not issue those waivers, which of course is exactly what happened with Donald Trump. And the Iranians are making some noises saying, if there's going to be a renegotiation, this time around, we want those sanctions lifted, right? Which means that the Congress has to pass laws or rescind laws that impose those sanctions on them. But for the Iranian people, they just want the sanctions gone. They don't want them having an impact on their lives. Right? It's for the leadership that these other issues become important. And again, I think that the issue that we're going to have is that the leadership is perfectly glad to have the sanctions lifted. And I think the leadership is actually perfectly glad to go back to the nuclear constraints of the original Iran agreements. Right? I believe that they made a decision in 2013 that they don't need a nuclear weapon. And I think they continue to feel that way, that they don't need a nuclear weapon. And therefore, they're willing to give up a certain amount of progress on their nuclear program in return for getting the sanctions lifted. But that's all they're interested in at this point in time, right? And if we come to them and say, we'd like additional constraints on you, what we're likely to hear from them is, fine, we want more from you too, right? And what they've consistently said that they want from us is they want us to pay them back for all of the money that they lost by President Trump's reimposition of sanctions. Okay, which could run to about $100 billion in lost oil revenue. I cannot imagine that Joe Biden is going to hand the Iranians $100 billion, right? I don't see that happening. And by the way, I think the Iranians know that. I think that this is a poison pill. And it's the Iranians saying, you know, if you want to try to go beyond the terms of the original JCPOA, you know, understand it's not going to be more for the same, right? It's not you get more and we get the same. It's going to be more for more. And, you know, we don't really think you're willing to pay the more that we're going to want. And my guess is that they're right about that.
So let me move from that, and we're bouncing back and forth a little bit, but it's all obviously tied together. Somebody asked an interesting question. Has President Biden called Prime Minister Netanyahu yet? And if not, why and how should we interpret that?
That's a hell of a question. I don't know. I do not know if he's done so. It's funny, you know, I was looking at Tony Blinken's an old friend of mine. I was looking at all the phone calls that he made. But yeah, I've not seen, I assume that President Biden had a conversation with Bibi at some point in time. I mean, how could you not? Bibi should have initiated that call right after the election. Yeah, I honestly do not know. You know, look, obviously it's very complicated right now with Bibi's corruption trial and, you know, another election pending. So all that stuff gets into the mix. You know, what I can say is that in my experience of Joe Biden, and again, he's someone I've known, the first time I briefed Joe Biden was in 1990. And, you know, I can't say he's a close personal friend, but I actually have friends who are pretty close to him. And I've just been in contact with Joe Biden. I said, I've spoken at events, you know, Joe Biden and I sharing the stage. This is someone who considers himself a very staunch friend of Israel. Not an unthinking friend of Israel, but a very staunch friend of Israel. And again, you know, I said, I just haven't checked whether he has spoken to Bibi, but I don't think that, I've not heard from any Israeli that they think that Joe Biden is going to sell them down the river, right? Their feelings about Joe Biden are very different from their feelings about Barack Obama. You know, they might not love him as much as Donald Trump, who let them do pretty much whatever they wanted to, but they recognize that this is a guy who's deeply committed to the special relationship. The question is really going to be about what does that mean in practice, given all of the other issues on his plate.
Okay, these are big subjects. It's interesting to have a night of this kind of a discussion here at Bethel. Sometimes we think we have to take care of the neighborhood, but I feel like it's opened up to, we're taking the issues of the world on, and fortunately we have a good guide here, but it's somewhat overwhelming. And our people in our audience are thinking about these things. Someone asked an interesting question, tied again to the region. With the jockeying between the Sunni and Shiite states, what do you think the impact will be on Israeli-Palestinian relations, and how concerned are you about Israel losing its democratic form of government? That somehow got all tied together. I'm not sure exactly why that would matter. That's a separate question in a way. But the Sunni and Shiite states you did talk about, but it has an impact on the Palestinian relationship
Sure.
in Israel.
And let me see if I can tie that last point in, because I can see how they would go together. I think
Yeah.
I understand what the question is getting at. So for the moment, obviously, the Israelis have tied themselves to the Sunni side in the great Sunni-Shia conflict. And by the way, just worth noting, it is more complicated than that, because there's a third side to it, right? They're the Turks and the Qataris, and the Muslim Brotherhood, and right, these guys are all Sunnis, but they're much more, in some ways, more fundamentalist Sunnis than most of the other Sunni states. And obviously the Saudis are in there too, so it's Middle East, it's all complicated. But let's just keep in mind that there is this other group hanging on out there as well. But simply put, yeah, the Israelis have mostly tied themselves to the Sunni states. And again, as pointed out, the Palestinians are overwhelmingly Sunni. Right? And as I said, I think that this is already putting pressure on the Palestinians, that the states that they have traditionally counted on to back them are no longer willing to do so. Now, I think the big issue, again, I keep talking about this fork in the road that we're going to face after the JCPOA, after the Iran nuclear deal hopefully gets re-signed. But I think that's true for the wider region as well. I think I've laid out some of the different ways. One of them is for the Palestinians, right? If the region does move in a more conflictual direction, right? If the Israelis and the Sunni Arabs come away from the re-signing of the Iran nuclear deal with the sense that the Americans are leaving us behind. The Americans don't care. They've signed the deal and they think they're done with the Middle East and they're going to go off and deal with their own domestic problems and leave us to our own devices, right? And we got to do what we got to do to fight the Iranians, right? Which will be a very conflictual Middle East, right? Now the Palestinians have a choice. They can choose to go with the Sunni Arab states, which would push them in the direction of making compromises and making peace with Israel, right? And maybe it even creates the narrative that they need, right? Maybe their leaders can go to their people and say, well, look, we would have fought to the death for the right of return, but the whole Sunni world is getting in bed with the Israelis and we can't fight the whole Sunni world. So guys, we're going to have to actually agree to this really quite reasonable compromise that the Israelis are offering us, right? That would be a good solution. A bad solution would be if they decide they can't, right? And they're just too unwilling to stand up to their own people, too afraid of getting assassinated, whatever it may be, too afraid of Hamas. And so instead they decide to throw in their lot with the Iranians, which is an option available to the Palestinians. The Iranians will receive them with open arms, right? We should keep in mind, we always tend to see this as Sunni Shia because the Saudis and our other allies want to portray it that way. The Iranians don't. Okay, the Iranians do have better relations with all kinds of Shia groups, mostly because the Shia have no place else to turn to. But it's worth keeping in mind that the Iranians are much more ecumenical when it comes to who their allies are. Basically, if you hate the United States and you hate our allies and are willing to use violence to overturn the regional status quo, the Iranians are delighted to back you, right? And let's remember, they have backed crazy Sunni groups like Hamas and Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda wants to wipe out all the Shia. The Iranians are willing to back them. They back crazy secular Marxist groups like the PKK. We found them tied into various Christian terrorist groups around the region. The only one we've never been able to connect them to is Jewish terrorist groups, right? And that may just be because maybe the Jews are better at it, right? Who knows? But the point is simply that the Iranians aren't as hung up on the Sunni-Shia divide as the Sunnis are, right? As if they backed Hamas, they continue to back Hamas. And I think that if the Palestinians made the wrong decision, what I would consider the wrong decision, and decided to pick the other side in this fight because they just felt like they couldn't make peace with Israel, I think that the Israelis will receive them with open arms, right? And if that's the case, now Israel is facing not just a revitalized Hamas, but a Palestinian Authority in the West Bank that is now thrown in its lot with Iran as well. And I think that it's going to be, I'll put it this way, incredibly difficult for any Israeli government to continue to handle the West Bank the way that they have. Right? And you can say it's been good and you can say it's been bad. All I'm saying is in that scenario, it will get worse because the Israelis will become far more frightened by the Palestinian Authority and will want to exert far more control over it. And so that's where I think the questioner's point about Israel's democratic character comes in, because under those circumstances, if the Palestinians decide to throw in their lot with the Iranians under these circumstances, I think that the Israelis will feel that they have no choice but to clamp down much, much harder on the West Bank.
So even in that context, there's a question being asked about potential war between Israel and Iran being inevitable. But in that context of what you just described in terms of the Palestinians maybe throwing their lot in desperation in with the Iranians, how does that scenario play out in that context?
Sure, I'll answer that this way. First, again, as an old intelligence analyst, I don't believe that anything, and also as a former policymaker, I don't believe anything's inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm not even sure, well, probably death. Okay, I'll go with that one. I'm not even sure taxes, right? I mean, again, President Trump seems to have completely avoided them. But you know, whether it's inevitable, certainly there is a very heavy risk of it, right? And you know, I think that the real takeaway from all of this, certainly my perspective on all of this, is, you know, the more I start playing out these scenarios, the more that I remember the old movie War Games, right? I think everybody on this call is old enough to remember War Games, right? At the end, the computer realizes that it's a stupid game and the best thing is not to play, right? And it, you know, winds up asking Matthew Broderick, you know, how about a nice game of chess instead, right? Wouldn't chess be a lot better than to play, you know, regional war in the Middle East, right? All of these scenarios are just really dangerous. We don't know where they end up, right? Especially when you start thinking about, you know, how nuclear weapons could enter the mix. And again, the terrorism and the refugees that we see spilling across the borders, right? I mean, you know, think about Brexit. I mean, you know, it's just insane, but, you know, you cannot explain Brexit without the Syrian and Libyan civil wars, right? It was those wars which push the British to disassociate themselves from Europe, right? All of these consequences. And so I look at it and say, boy, you know, this is just a grand social science experiment that I'd really prefer not to run, right? And, you know, my own perspective is I actually don't think it would require a lot from the United States to avoid this, right? I think that a little bit of reassurance of our allies, slowing down our disengagement from the region, showing them some love, right? Just reversing some of the stuff that both Obama and Trump did, right? We're not talking, nobody's talking about, certainly I'm not talking about, you know, deploying tens of thousands of troops to the Middle East. I actually think that the troop presence we have in the region is perfectly fine. And by the way, it is so much smaller than most people realize. Most people think we have this enormous force in the Middle East. We don't. We have a tiny force in the Middle East, right? It's nothing compared to what we have in Europe. And, you know, it's minuscule compared to what we have in the Pacific. Tiny, tiny little forces in the Middle East, right? It's mostly just a matter of staying engaged, convincing our allies that we have their back, that we're not going to abandon them, and showing the Iranians that when they attack our allies, they are going to face us, right? And worth noting, again, I'm not a very big fan of the Trump administration's Middle East policy, but, you know, one thing that they did illustrate very well, you know, when they killed Qasem Soleimani, right, you will note that the Iranians really did nothing, right? They made a very symbolic response, lobbing about a dozen ballistic missiles at two massive American facilities, right, where they gave a bunch of our guys concussions. Right? This was a nothing burger of a response because the Iranians have enormous respect for American military capabilities. And so again, it doesn't take much to deter them. It mostly takes a willingness to do so. And I said, from my perspective, you know, I tend to be conservative with a small c. You know, I'd much prefer to kind of, you know, avoid, as I said, this grand social science experiment. I actually think that the costs are much more reasonable than the risks we'd be running.
Well, talking about Iran, other people have asked questions about Iran, and one person asked, "What political advantage or good do progressives see in Iran?" He cites them as the biggest exporters of terrorism in the world, and you've talked about that to some extent. But is it an alignment with politically progressive people in the United States who see some advantage beyond just a strategic advantage for, as you described it earlier tonight too? But just to comment on that, I think would be
Sure.
interesting.
So first, full disclaimer, I don't agree with this position at all. And again, I say that as someone who was in favor of the Bill Clinton's rapprochement with Iran. I was delighted to be able to implement that policy for him. And someone who was actually very much in favor of Barack Obama's efforts to reach a rapprochement with Iran. I do not believe that the progressive approach to Iran is the right one. That said, I will, as many of my friends, I will try to channel their perspective. And their perspective really starts with our behavior and our allies, right? And their perspective is very much that the United States has done enormous damage all across the region, that we have been the primary aggressor in the region, that our actions have threatened the Iranians, made them deeply uncomfortable, that Iran's actions are overwhelmingly a response to our actions, which they see as very threatening to Iran, and to the actions of our allies, right? And again, the position that my friends will typically enunciate about our allies is, look, first of all, these people are awful, right? There's nothing good about them. They're human rights abusers. They're racist, sexist, misogynist, you name it, awful people, oppressive autocrats, and they also are threatening to the Iranians, right? And so you can't blame the Iranians for wanting to defend and deter. And yeah, occasionally the Iranians may go overboard a little bit, but anything that the Iranians have done, we've done worse and our allies have done worse. Right? And you hear this expressed in statements like, very famously President Obama saying, the Saudis have to learn to share the Middle East with the Iranians, which, I got to tell you, just from a diplomatic perspective, was one of the dumbest things I've ever heard any president ever say. Even if you believe that, you don't say it. But I think that it really did reflect his position, which is that our allies, the Saudis to begin with, are no better than the Iranians, and that he seems to have a lot more sympathy for the Iranians than he does for the Saudis and our other allies, right? So that seems to be where the progressives come from. And so it seems to be mostly about, moral equivalency, and they're seeing moral equivalency in the behaviors of Iran and our allies and ourselves. That's about the best I can do in explaining it.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, to go back to the Saudis to some extent, someone raised the question of what do we have in terms of agreements that would put us in a position to defend the Saudis in the case of some attack. I don't know what attack that would be, and I don't think the questioner is saying that he had an answer to that, but what is it that ties us together on that level, considering all the other things you talked about in terms of the Saudis living up to agreements in general? What would put us over the edge to intervene is the question.
Sure. Well, and first, we're not allies. We're not formal allies of the Saudis. There is 75 years of precedent going back to Franklin Roosevelt. If you're talking about like foundational statements of American policy, the two most important are the Carter Doctrine, 1980. President Carter announces that the United States will use all means necessary to protect the free flow of oil from the Persian Gulf from external sources. And then President Reagan extends that to threats to the oil from internal sources, right? And those are the two foundational statements. And the United States is, up until the Trump administration, consistently acted on that, consistently acted in defense of the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary to it. In terms of what we could do anything we want, right? This because the Saudis want us to defend them, right? And that's a pretty easy thing for them. I think the bigger question again is, what do we want? What do we see as threatening, right? And I think that's, the last point that the question raised, Bruce, I think is really the critical one here. And, I will answer that from the Saudi perspective, right? And I think that's what's important, right? Because from our perspective, we don't want anyone mucking around with the flow of oil, right? We have this absolutely moronic debate where we talk about this thing, oil independence or energy independence, which doesn't exist, right? We talk about it as if it does, right? It's, like, I don't know, Elvis or, the Loch Ness Monster, right? We talk about it as if it's a real thing. It's not. There is no such thing. Because the bottom line is that the entire world's economy still floats on a sea of oil. And, even though we're a net exporter of oil, it doesn't matter. If there's something that happens to Middle Eastern oil, China's economy tanks and Europe's economy tanks and South America's economy tanks and South Asia's economy tanks and our economy tanks because they're all of our trade partners. And we can't withstand that kind of a blow to our trade, right? So we continue to have an interest. But at the end of the day, that's still a pretty good position to be in because there is enough oil and enough spare capacity right now, especially because of shale, that it takes a lot to move the oil market in such a way that it would really become threatening to our economy, right? So if you ask the question, what's problematic for us, the collapse of the Saudi government, that would be horrific. The loss of all of Iraq and Kuwait and the UAE's oil, that would be horrific. But, worth noting, we lost all of Libya's oil, all of it, basically back in 2012, right? And the global economy didn't miss a beat, right? So it tells you where we are. So from the perspective of, what do we care about in terms of our direct interests? We actually have a fair amount of flexibility. The bigger problem, and the reason I'm putting this back on the Saudis, is that point that I made before, which is that when our allies in the region have different interests from us, right? And when they feel those interests threatened, right, they do things. They often do very dangerous and destabilizing things. And I'll mention again, like invade Yemen, right? And they've done other things that have also been very problematic over the years, right? We don't want them doing those things. And that's about the reassurance piece, right? And so the question really becomes, you ask me, what do we need to do for our allies in the region? We need to reassure them enough that they don't do stupid things, right? I'm deliberately channeling Barack Obama, right? It's not just that we shouldn't do stupid stuff, it's we don't want them to do stupid stuff either, right? And there the issue is, I'm going to be very specific about this, what President Trump did was terrifying to them. The Iranians started attacking their oil exports, right? And the Iranians, again, have tremendous respect for the United States. They didn't know what we were going to do, but they were really afraid that if they started attacking the oil, we would retaliate. Why? Because we've always retaliated, right? That is the core of the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary, is they threaten the oil and we retaliate for it. Trump did nothing. And so the Iranians start escalating and escalating. And we get to the point where in September of 2019, they launched that drone attack on Abqaiq. Now, I'm sure most of you probably haven't heard of Abqaiq. If you do, you don't know what the hell it is. Abqaiq, I'll be a little bit glib here, but I'm not being wrong. Abqaiq is the beating heart of the global economy. Okay, 2/3 of all of Saudi Arabia's oil goes through Abqaiq. It is a single point of failure. You take out Abqaiq, you're taking out 7 million barrels per day of oil production, right? There's no amount of fracking in the world that's going to be able to compensate for that. Okay. And what the Iranians did, and they were so clever, is they hit it and they took 5 million barrels per day off the market for 2 weeks, right? With incredible precision, saying to the Saudis, we only took the oil off, we only took part of it off for 2 weeks. We can take all of it off forever, right? That is what was frightening to the Saudis. What was frightening the Saudis was they did that and the United States did nothing. President Trump's response was, I don't care, unless they kill an American or an American drone, right? I mean, my God, a drone, shooting down a drone would be worse in his mind than destroying Abqaiq and trashing our economy with it. That was terrifying to the Saudis. I was in Riyadh in December and met with some of the most senior princes in that government, the absolute most senior princes. They could not believe that the United States would allow the Iranians to attack Abqaiq and we would do nothing in response. And the truth is, we didn't have to do much, right? There are all kinds of discrete targets out there. There's all kinds of stuff that we need to, all we needed to do was to show the Iranians, you can't touch something like that. That's going too far. So you ask me, what do we need to do to defend, for our relationship with the Saudis? That's the kind of thing. And again, that's a pretty high threshold. Think about how long it took the Iranians to get there, how completely, non-responsive we had to be to each step of the escalatory ladder before they got to attacking Abqaiq.
That is something. I hadn't realized the impact of that, actually, personally. And it sounds like you're saying that to date, there has not been a response to that, but at the same time, it hasn't been attacked again. So may lead me to what I think may be our last question from our audience. The question really has to do with whether or not Biden has inherited a mess in the Middle East. We've talked a lot about that today. How we define it, I don't know, is really the issue, but it could be viewed from more than one point of view. Bear with me 1 second here. Somebody just jumped in when I said that was the last question. Somebody gave me another question. So what this questioner is saying, there are historic peace agreements with the Abraham Accords. The caliphate has been basically crushed and overall things are quiet right now. Even the biggest proponents of the JCPOA acknowledge it as flawed, which you've talked about a lot tonight. And in terms of strategy, you've talked about it. The question finally is, can you look at this? Let me use the words of our questioner. He said, respectfully, I think returning to the JCPO without revising it would be a tactical mistake. And just to comment on that, because it sort of lingers or hovers over the conversation, that this can't just go on the way it is and something has to change. But that was the context of this questioner's point of view.
Sure, I love that question. And I'll say, yes, I would also like to see it revised. The questions that I've been asked so far, what do I think the Biden administration is going to do? Nobody's asked me what I think we should do. And my feeling was, look, again, cards on the table. I grudgingly supported the JCPOA when it occurred. I grudgingly supported the Iran deal. You can go back, you can find, I testified before the Senate, the House, right? I'm very much on the record about this. What I said at the time was, look, this isn't a great agreement. I think we could have done better, but it meets our minimal needs, right? That said, we need to look at it as being nothing but a placeholder. It's something that has bought us 10 to 15 years. And we need to use those 10 to 15 years to put in place something better. And, I absolutely agree with the sentiment of the questioner that, I am concerned that by going, I think I expressed this, by going back to the JCPOA, the Biden administration is going to lose that opportunity, right? And I think at some level they understand that. I think at some level they don't want to do that. But I have the strong sense from them that they're going to feel that they have no choice but do that. And that what's going to end up happening is they will make a brief stab at trying to negotiate a better, longer, wider deal. The Iranians are going to say absolutely not. And the administration is going to say, fine, let's pocket just going back to the original agreement for now. And we will call that a win, and it will be a win, right? We'll take care of the Iranian nuclear program. We'll put it back on ice for another period of time. And we'll continue to have talks with them. And we'll hope that maybe something will happen that will allow us to make some progress with them in those talks. Again, my fear is that we won't, because the administration will find itself increasingly pulled out of the region, right? This is my point, which is if you want to get the Iranians to make further concessions, you actually have to engage further with the region. You've got to actually engage with them. You've got to shut down all of their efforts to make gains across the region. You've got to show them that there's going to be a price to be paid, and you've got to create additional leverage, right? And especially because you're giving away the sanctions. And we already saw that the sanctions failed with Trump. The sanctions weren't enough to get a new agreement. You got to create additional leverage. Again, that can only come from remaining engaged in the region. But as I said, I think that the last thing that the Biden administration is going to want to do a year from now is engage more with the region, right? And when someone, and probably be my friend Rob Malley, comes to them and says, look, if you want to get more, you're going to have to engage the region more and create this kind of leverage. Or you're just going to have to accept that this is as good as it gets and, you know, just put on a good face and say, yeah, we're going to continue to negotiate with the Iranians and realize you're going to get nothing. And my fear is that that's where we're going to end up. And, you know, Bruce, to the first part of that question, right? You know, is the Biden administration inheriting a mess? Of course they are, right? Every administration inherits a mess in the Middle East, right? And as someone who's been working on the Middle East for 32, 33 years now, inside the US government and out, right? The thing to me that's so remarkable is that every administration comes in, sees the Middle East and goes, oh, wow, that place is a mess. I don't want to have anything to do with it, right? And then a bunch of people like me says, that's true, but it can get worse. And if you don't pay the lesser costs now, we're going to wind up paying bigger costs down the road. And of course, we never want to do it, right? We convince ourselves that we can ignore the place. The place gets worse, and then we come back and have to pay bigger costs, right? And I've just seen this movie again and again and again and again, right? It's Einstein's definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get different results. And I'm afraid that I'm going to watch this movie one more time with the Biden administration. That's my great fear.
Well, I know we're kind of fighting the clock here a little bit, and I did say that was the last question, but one more question came up, and it kind of ties the whole thing together in terms of the region and what is going on in Israel. So let me just read that question, and I think you can, maybe we'll just conclude the audience participation, which has been great and really helped us shape the conversation tonight. Thank everybody. So the question is, how stable is Saudi Arabia now, given MBS's unpredictability and some of his bad decisions, which you've gone through, locking up various princes and the Ritz, obviously the Khashoggi issue, and pressuring some to give up their wealth and other things in the country itself. Is there a risk that the other Saudi princes could be turmoil politically, maybe in turmoil politically there? And how would that impact Israel, to bring it back to the issue that so many of us are concerned about? How does that impact Israel and the stability of the region entirely, that unrest and kind of wiggling platform that Saudi Arabia is operating under?
Another great question. Okay, let me see if I can do this justice in the time remaining to us. When I think about MBS, the image that comes to mind is I just got in some terrible accident and I need urgent medical care. And a 16-year-old kid in a Maserati pulls up and says, jump in, I'll get you to the hospital, and takes off. And he's going 100 miles per hour, right? And, you know, on two wheels at every curve. And part of me is terrified that I'm going to die in the car before I ever get to the hospital. But I know I got to get to the hospital as fast as I can. And there's another part of me that's grateful that this kid is going so damn fast, right? To me, this is the dilemma that we have with MBS. Saudi Arabia desperately needs to change, right? I have been calling for political, economic, and social reform in Saudi Arabia for 25 years. You've got some of my books up there. The book that I wrote in 2008, right? One of the key themes about it was the importance of reform among the Arab states. Because as I warned then, and remember this is 3 years before the Arab Spring, I said, if there isn't reform, we are going to see revolutions, civil wars, insurgencies, and greater terrorism in the Arab states. And guess what? That's exactly what we're getting, right? MBS, to his great credit, understands that. He is trying to reform Saudi Arabia economically and socially in an incredibly dramatic way, right? He is going to try to drag that country economically and socially into the 21st century. That's really important. If somebody doesn't do that, Saudi Arabia probably is going to go up. That regime is not going to last the way that it has for another 25 or 50 years. And then we're making this bet as to whether we can wean the world off of Saudi oil before the place collapses, right? And that's another one of those big social science experiments I'd really prefer not to run. And at some level, when MBS, both when I wrote that book and when MBS took charge, I've been, spent a lot of time looking at the history of these major reforms. You often need this kind of, single-minded autocrat with tremendous power and absolute determination to put these reforms through. And by the way, that's true in democracies. Remember what the Republicans used to say about FDR, right? Who was trying to do the exact same thing, right? In the context of the New Deal and dealing with the Depression, right? It takes a tremendous amount of determination and a willingness to break lots of eggs, right, to make that kind of an omelet. So I look at MBS and say, some of what he's doing, he probably needs to. And then on the other hand, he is incredibly reckless, right? He does stuff that is so absolutely stupid. I remember hearing about when Jamal Khashoggi was killed, right? And immediately what I thought of was the great quote from Talleyrand, right? And the circumstances are perfect, right? Where he said, that's worse than a crime, it's a mistake. Right, and the circumstances are perfect because that was Napoleon murdering a dissident of his regime, right, the Duc d'Enghien. So circumstances are absolutely perfect. It's like, why did you do that? That was so bloody stupid and gratuitous, right? And as I pointed out to you, MBS is interested in economic reform and social reform. He is not interested in political reform, right? And I think that has to happen too. So to me, this is the great dilemma of MBS, is on the one hand, I can point to all kinds of things that he's doing where I go, that's really smart. That's exactly what he needed to do, right? And then other stuff where it's, why on earth did you do that, right? What possessed you to do that? That was the worst thing that you could possibly do, right? And we're kind of along for the ride. And the one thing I will say about this is, again, this is one of these where you'll pardon me from kind of beating this dead horse, but it is an area where I think that the United States could be a lot more helpful, right? And a number of years ago, I was part of a task force run by Steve Hadley, George Bush's national security advisor, and Madeleine Albright, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, looking at the Middle East. I was in charge of their security working group. The report that came out of it talked about the importance of reform and talked about needing to have a bargain between the US and our allies. The bargain was, we will defend them from external threats, primarily from Iran. And in return, they have to reform to deal with their internal threats, right? That bargain is still out there. The Saudis desperately want us to continue to protect them. And as I've suggested to you, I actually don't think protecting them is really hard at all, right? Really not hard at all, because as I said, the Iranians are tremendously wary of our actual capabilities, right? My feeling is, if we can go to the Saudis and say to them, hey, look, the American public want us out in the Middle East. We're willing to continue to defend you, but that requires you to reform and reform in a smart way. And that means we get a say in how you do your reform. To my mind, that would be a really wonderful way for the Biden administration to handle MBS and to handle right now what he's got. He's got a lot of political capital because MBS is worried that he's going to walk away from the Middle East. I'd love to see him go to him and say, you want me to stay? Fine. Here are the terms under which I will stay, right? Because I think the Saudis would gladly accept.
So thank you for engaging us this way and for bringing out some great questions from the people who joined us this evening. When we first started talking before the program started, I asked you if you were breathing easier with the election. And now I'm thinking, you said yes, but with all the stuff percolating in your head, I don't know how you're breathing easier. I have to go take a nap myself. So thank you.
At least analyst. It's a terrible career choice.
Maybe that's it. So I'm going to turn this back over to Joyce, and thank you so much again, Ken. It's just been an incredible pleasure and really enlightening for us all, I'm sure.
Thank you. And thank you, Bruce,
so
for your yeoman work.
Thank you.
Moderator.
Good, Joyce. Joyce, I think you need to, yeah, there you go. Okay, great. Thank you again for having us.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for curating and asking those wonderful and salient questions. Thank you all for joining us, but most importantly, thank you, Dr. Pollack, for a fascinating, informative evening. You've given us quite a lot to digest, and the depth and breadth of your knowledge is really astounding, and we feel very fortunate that you graciously agreed to join us tonight. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Pollack. And I look forward, hopefully you all can join us at our next Sisterhood event on March 8th. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, Dr. Pollack, and thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Joyce. Thank all of you for your phenomenal questions.
Be well.